We're going to look at what are the barriers to inclusivity, and while we're going to be focusing on race mainly today, obviously a lot of those things can be transferable to other protected characteristics. And we're going to look a little bit at next steps and think about what does that actually mean for me in my day-to-day, rather than thinking about, policy change, which is always an important part of making sure that inclusion works. It's not the be all and end all of getting this right. Okay. So what is then the impact on Black and brown children and young people? So obviously it'll impact on their emotional well-being, right? Because instances of racism or unconscious bias don't happen in a vacuum. They happen within a context, of media, of news outlets, of social media, online bullying, what they're getting face-to-face, what they're hearing, their representatives in government say about people that look like them. And that's a lot to kind of process. So we talk about their emotional well-being, so that leads to increased anxiety and stress. It could also lead to lower self-esteem, and obviously the racial trauma of persistent exposure to racism. How do I feel about myself when this is how the world sees me? It's a really powerful thing for children and young people developmentally to ask themselves in the first place. But now you're throwing racism in the mix. What does that do for how I feel about my place in the world and what I can achieve? So then we have reduced participation, because it can discourage them from participating in sports. They might lead to lower levels of physical activity and missing out of the benefits of sports. And there's some research that shows that children from white or mixed heritage are more likely to engage in sports compared to the other groups of young people from a ethnicity point of view. The fear of facing racist abuse can cause performance anxiety as well. I mean, folks, we've seen some of the things that some of our footballers have had to deal with, from people on the sidelines. That's tough. And these are people who are professional players, and young people are seeing that, professional sportsmen coming off the field in tears because of the abuse that they've had to suffer. Do I want to get involved in that? Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe I want to protect my own well-being. So we might have dropout rates as well, especially if we have a culture, of banter, which we're going to talk about, which is not addressed. Why would you want to come back if that leads to that anxiety? And that's our responsibility. And then not involving ourselves in all of these things that are out in the world can then lead to that social isolation. And we've had those messages from Childline a lot, that people just feel scared. They feel scared of the police. They feel scared of being called names. They feel scared of going out in their streets, especially after the riots last summer. It's a scary place to be. And if you add in, the mental impact of COVID on young people especially, that's a lot to have to try and cope with when you're a child and you're growing up and you're trying to figure out where you are in the world, right? So some of the impacts of this are access to sports. So in the 10-year strategy, Sport England notes that right now the opportunities to get involved in sport and activity and reap the rewards of being active depend too much on your background, your gender, your bank balance, and your postcode. So I want us all to kind of take a moment to consider what that's like for a child or young person. What is that travel like to the club? How do they get there? Can they afford the stuff that they need to engage in the sport? What might put them off? But we also have that behavior during sports, and CPSU has some really great content around that concept of banter and bullying. And where does it kind of cross the line? Because we do often hear that racial jokes are part and parcel of having banter. And the Merriam-Webster dictionary just defines banter as joking or a form of exchanging joking repartee. Okay, so if we go back to what we've learned about structural racism and the context in which that banter is happening, because it's not happening in isolation. There are lots of different messages coming through to those young people. that can have like a real impact on them. You know, we were talking about earlier that dropout rates. Yeah. Because there's also nobody standing up for me saying, hey, I love that you think that's funny. It's not funny here. We're not going to talk to each other like that. Yeah. Racial banter doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within a current context. Yeah. And the safeguarding sports standards emphasize the importance of creating a safe and inclusive environment, right, for all athletes, which includes ensuring equitable treatment and opportunities. But we have to be able to pick up on those nuances of racism. We have to be able to pick up on what's happening there and how that might impact on a child. Because the trauma responses, for example, are, you know, most of us know the trauma responses, right? So you've got fight, which is physical aggression. Yeah. So we're seeing one of our kids maybe get into a fight. Not okay, but yeah, trauma-informed practice helps us to think about what happened to you rather than what's wrong with you, right? So let's ask that question. We could have flight, yeah, so running away, backing away, dropping out. We also have freeze, so the immobility, involuntary response that can preserve the body from injury. But we also have flop, so that's like collapse or play dead. It looks very similar to freezing. We often see the flop response, folks with in situations of domestic abuse as the trauma response friend. Because if you're my friend and if I think your jokes are funny and you think that I think your jokes are funny, then you're not going to make fun of me. Self-preservation, right? So we hear a joke that's not okay. Yeah. We see the young person who's a subject of that joke laughing, and then we think that's fine. Where actually that kid is just trying to preserve their well-being. Because ultimately, we can have different responses to those kind of racialized banter bullying moments. Okay, so we can acquiesce, which comes from the Latin term quiescere, meaning to be quiet. Yeah, so the person who's in the minority lasts long, doesn't comment, or starts worse, starts to internalize that hate speech. They can withdraw, as I said again, so they can withdraw from that situation, or they could respond either by saying what's wrong or by leaving or by fighting. Okay. I know we're really short on time. Sorry. So I'm just going to go through these quickly. What some of the barriers to inclusion are poor policy and practice, okay, an exclusive culture. I say this all the time. It was Peter Drucker who said it first. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. You could have the best policy in the world. It will not work if your culture doesn't align with the ideas and the vision and the mission behind it. Lack of leadership. Lack of leadership in terms of addressing this. Unawareness of personal bias, so a lack of self-awareness around that, and apathy. Yeah, that can happen as well. That people are just not really interested in having this conversation, don't think it's relevant. Yeah, because we're sure we don't have any Black or brown people in our team. Why would we care? Well, it's overlooking the whole problem that you're having at the minute, right? So the opposite of that in terms of our call to action and the next steps is to look at developing policies. So what policies promote diversity and inclusion and address specific needs of underrepresented groups. So we're moving away from equality, everybody's the same, yeah, to equity. People need different interventions in order to feel able to participate, yeah. So this goes across all marginalized people, right? We're looking at it from a place of equity. What do we need to put in place to facilitate? And thinking very clearly about what that then means for our policy. But equally ensure that we have a culture that is able to bring that policy to life and make that policy something real rather than just a sheet of paper. How do we have these discussions? What training do we have? How do we talk about it with each other? How do we talk about it with the kids? And what does that leadership look like? How do our leaders support this work? How do we not just say the thing, but do the thing. And give opportunities to talk about personal bias. And that is hard. I am not for 1 second trying to say that this is going to be easy. Yeah, it's difficult to do this work, but it's important if we're creating safe spaces for children and young people to understand what am I potentially doing that can facilitate or perpetuates a barrier, and ultimately allyship. If that's not my lived experience, how can I use my privilege as a leader, as an adult, as somebody who has a specific piece of learning or knowledge or skill behind me? How can I use that to support this group so that we can get the better out of them? And ultimately, that's what it's all about, right? So how do we get the best out of the kids, all kids that come to our clubs, so that they can enjoy the sport?